everybody, and welcome for one more session here from the Cloud Lunch and Learn team. I'm Jackson Felden, and will be your moderator for today. And yeah, one more great session today. I have here with me Gent, and he's ready to present AKS on Azure Stack. Kind of interesting subject for myself. And yeah, I was talking to Gent. If you have any questions, just type on the chat box, and then as the questions come, I will kind of interrupt the questions and make sure everything gets sorted. Yeah, Gent, if you want to give a quick intro about yourself, and then I will share your screen, and we can get the show started.
Yeah, sure. In fact, I have a couple of slides, talking about my introduction.
Mhm.
So if you can probably start sharing screen, I'll proceed with my introduction and then get into the subject. How about that?
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. Anyway, I will be
Yeah,
here on the background. If you need anything from me, just let me know.
sure.
And otherwise, yeah, have a great presentation. Let me just
Thanks.
share
Thanks,
your screen.
Jackson.
Yeah, you are ready to go.
All right.
Okay, I will
So
talk to you later. Thank you.
thank you. Thanks, Jackson. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. Very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on the time zone that you're tuning in from. So my name is Jayant. So I know it's a pretty mouthful there. So you can call me Jay. Jay is perfectly all right. Um, and so I work as a senior principal engineering technologist at Dell Technologies. So it's my 14th year at Dell. Yeah, I seem to be kind of liking the journey. In fact, I joined the company way back in 2001. I left in between and then rejoined the company in 2001, 2009. So I'm a tech professional who's got about 20 plus years of experience. Started off with the storage industry, and then I was supporting servers and storage for Dell, and then I was with engineering, and then now I'm actually into tech sales. Also, I'm part of engineering, so I'm also into tech sales. So that's my LinkedIn. So feel free to connect. There's a QR code. You can scan that QR code and connect with me as well. So I work as the senior principal engineering technologist at Dell. At Dell, what we do is we do the evangelism for the Microsoft hybrid cloud portfolio, which I'm going to obviously talk you through. I'm also a speaker. I speak at various events. Evangelism is through speaking, blogging, pretty much all of that, right? So we share the knowledge with the community. So we do a lot of we are hands-on, completely hands-on. That means we test things out day in and day out. So, and talking about my vlogging, I have a YouTube channel as well, which is called Jayant on Cloud. Feel free to subscribe to my channel. This is purely dedicated to the hybrid cloud. In right now, I'm covering mostly the Microsoft hybrid cloud portfolio. It has videos starting from just the basics of what's hybrid cloud computing is all about, which is 101 level, and then I take you all the way into 401 plus levels as well. So depending on your flavors, feel free to kind of scroll through those videos. Probably the initial videos are, very, very high level videos, probably at 101, and later on it starts getting more technical. I'm also, I do a lot of information, blogging at GitHub as well. So I do a lot of documentation. In fact, the latest one that I've done is the learning to understand Kubernetes. So those who are actually completely new to Kubernetes, probably you may want to kind of take a dive into this. This is my URL page. I'm happy to share these slides later as well. And then I have the Azure Stack HCI labs. I'm going to talk about what is Azure Stack HCI and so on. So lots of good stuff. Feel free to take a look at it. As part of the agenda, so we're going to look at what is Azure Stack HCI, right? And AKS, which is right now available in public Azure. What if it's made available on Azure Stack HCI today? Because a lot of organizations today are looking at, hey, ground to cloud. Gone are the days where people are just thinking about, ground to cloud, but they're also looking at cloud to ground because that's where the industry is. So it's somewhere in between, right? It's not really on either sides of the spectrum, right? So customers are trying to land somewhere. That's where hybrid is becoming a big focus there, and that's where Azure Stack HCI plays a very niche role and a critical role in kind of bridging that gap to achieve the cloud operating model on premises. So we're going to look at that. I will have, so this is going to be a demo heavy session, by the way. Like I said, I'm a hands-on guy, so I don't believe in just showing slides, but I will show you a lot of demos, recorded demos, just to get you guys an understanding of what it's all about. Basically, it's about setting up AKS and modernizing applications on premises. One of the biggest challenges a lot of customers have today and organizations have is they carry these legacy applications, which are typically hosted on a virtualized platform or a very old, age-old infrastructure, but they move into cloud hyperscalers, and that's when they start modernizing, right? Now, what if there are regulatory needs that need to be met, which means the data sovereignty, regulatory compliances, and all of that, right? Where the data and applications cannot go to public cloud. So in such scenarios, they're compelled to retain such applications and data on premises. At the same time, think about modernizing them. So this is where AKS on Azure Stack HCI really helps to containerize some of these virtualized applications into containers, and we're going to look at how AKS can be handy there. And not just that, right? So one of the reasons why a lot of organizations and customers go to cloud is the ability to use pay-as-you-go kind of a service, right? It's just like a consumption-based model. You consume the database, you just pay for what you consume, and you get out, right? Without having to worry about the underlying infrastructure, which is actually hosting the database. What if I told you the same experience is now available on Azure Stack HCI as well? So which means customers, without having to worry about the underlying infrastructure, the hardware, the operating subsystem, all they need to do is just spin up a SQL managed instance, right from Azure control plane, but the database actually resides on Azure Stack HCI cluster. So we're going to look at that. And then Q&A, so it does not really have to be towards the fag end. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. The moderator is going to kind of bubble that up and interrupt me. All right. So quickly, so like I said, a lot of organizations today are looking at cloud to ground. So which has become a new norm these days. According to Gartner, according to IDC, and according to a lot of research, 90% of the organizations today have a hybrid cloud strategy, which means they're not only just specific to a hyperscaler, which is a public cloud, but they want to kind of deploy their applications in multiple public clouds like AWS, Azure, GCP. Not just that, they also are increasingly deploying workloads on premises, right? In a centralized data center, in their own customers' data center, or for instance, edge. In fact, edge is a very, very interesting use case. According to IDC, by 2025, 70% of the world's data growth is expected to be originated at the edge. I mean, these are like phenomenal numbers, right? Now, that's the reason the bigger players like Microsoft, Amazon, Google are increasingly looking at how do I really tap into these data and make customers' journey as a cloud operating model, which they've experienced in public cloud, seamlessly experience the same thing on premises or even their edge infrastructure. This is where the real competition is, and this is where the industry is heading. So talking about that, I think Microsoft is really well poised to kind of handle that situation. In fact, probably by any stretch of imagination, probably Microsoft is the only partner who has this robust portfolio to kind of meet every need of the customer, be it edge use case, be it customers' centralized data center, modernization of their infrastructure, or connect back to the public cloud as well, which is Azure in this case. So they have a very, very seamless way of doing this. And we're going to see how Azure Arc, I think most of you may be familiar with Azure Arc. So Azure Arc is an Azure service that basically, it acts like a glue to stitch your infrastructure into Azure control plane. So let's say you have IT assets that are residing outside of Azure, right? It could be on GCP, it could be on AWS, it could be on a private cloud, it could be in an edge location. Now, the biggest challenges most of these organizations, as they start out to kind of hybrid cloud approach, is the governance part of it, because you have disparate tooling, you have different ways of management. It kind of makes things complicated for customers as well, because multi-cloud is here. It's not just it's the vision, but multi-cloud is here, right? So, but at the same time, customers want a single pane of glass to manage all of their IT assets right from a single pane of glass. That's exactly what Azure Arc does today. So we're going to look at how Azure Arc can be so powerful. Okay, now coming back to the Microsoft Hybrid Cloud portfolio, so you have three distinct products here. Now, one is Hub, HCI, and Edge. I'm going to come back to Hub, HCI later, because that's going to be the focal point of discussion today. Hub is, for example, customers, they need to meet data regulation, which means the data cannot leave the country of origin. Talk about, for example, GDPR, right? It's one of the great examples of that, right? So the data cannot leave the country of origin. Now, what if this data is getting generated in an edge location where there's no connectivity to any of the public cloud? In this case, it's Azure. So the data has to be processed then and there. So that's exactly what Azure Stack Hub today does. So it's basically, it's a cluster, it's a physical hardware, it's an appliance that's delivered to the customer's premises, just like an Azure data center is today, right? But it's obviously a small form factor of Azure data center, but you can deploy the same native Azure services on Azure Stack Hub. So it's exactly the same set of Azure services, but they're running locally in a customer's firewall. As simple as that, because they need to meet the data regulations. Azure Stack Edge, those who are familiar with DataBox Edge, people used to carry the data that was originated in the edge because there's no connectivity, take it back to the centralized location, and then upload it to Azure for further analytics, and then bring it back again, and back and forth, right? So what Microsoft did is they kind of built some of the intelligence in the edge itself, so that customers don't have to kind of do back and forth, which means the data gets processed in the edge. So, for example, typical data that gets processed is image inferencing, video inferencing, or IoT data kind of processing. So those are the use cases of Azure Stack Edge. Azure Stack Edge today can be ordered. It's an appliance, it's a physical hardware, comes with the software that's built on top of it, but it's delivered as a complete solution right from an Azure portal. So go to Azure portal, just type in search Azure Stack Edge. You can actually order Azure Stack Edge, and Microsoft delivers that, right? Azure Stack HCI, on the other hand, like we talked about, right? Many organizations today have already migrated to public cloud, but the bigger challenge is they're now looking at repatriation, because there is a need. There's a compelling need to bring some of the data back to on-premises. Now, the bigger challenge is, how do they really modernize some of the on-premises infrastructure? Because that's an aging infrastructure. That's the reason they actually moved to public cloud. So this is exactly where Azure Stack HCI comes into the picture. So Azure Stack HCI is a software-defined architecture, which is HCI. HCI stands for hyper-converged infrastructure. So where you're actually collapsing, abstracting the compute, storage, and network into a single unit. So it's all managed from the software standpoint. Unlike, for instance, if you think about legacy infrastructure, like, you had big servers, and then big storage, and then network, they're all connected together, and you need a storage administrator to manage your storage, and a system administrator who manages your servers, and then network administrator who used to manage your switches, right? So there's so much of complexity and dependency on the IT skills, right? That is considerably reduced in HCI. So HCI is a software-defined way of implementing data centers, right? All right, so I spoke so much about Azure Stack HCI, but what if I told you Azure Stack HCI, although it's actually running on premises, is actually an Azure service? So much. I mean, you think about it, right? So as you can see the screen here, I've logged into Azure portal.azure.com. If I go to the services, you will see Azure Stack HCI here, right? So it's actually a service. So that's the native integration that Microsoft provides today. So which means I, as a customer, can manage my Azure Stack HCI clusters. These Azure Stack HCI clusters actually deployed in customers' on-premise environment. But here also has assets, IT assets deployed in public Azure. Now, what we're trying to do is provide them the single pane of glass, which is portal.azure.com. And then they can not only access their existing Azure services, which they're using. In addition to that, they can also access their Azure Stack HCI clusters, which is deployed in their data centers. Very, very powerful way of doing it, right? Single pane of glass, you enjoy the benefits of just like an Azure service there. All right, so any question, Jackson? I would love to take it up. I think there are no.
Uh, no, so far all good and all
Okay.
good. Yeah, no questions so far. Yeah.
All right. All right. So, okay. So with that, let me get started with AKS on Azure Stack HCI. I think most of you are familiar today on what is AKS. AKS is the third most popular container distributions out there. Okay. It is the most sought after, especially for customers who are actually deployed their resources in public Azure and they're trying to modernize their applications into containers. So AKS plays a very, very critical role there. Now, what Microsoft did is they realized that there is a tremendous need for the same customers to modernize their aging applications, which are typically virtualized, which means they're running on a virtual machine. Like, there's a lot of dependency on the operating system. There's a lot of dependency on the infrastructure, the underlying infrastructure, and so on and so forth. But they're begging to be modernized because if customers don't modernize today, they're going to be left behind because their competitors are modernizing. So there's a compelling need for customers to modernize. So this is where Microsoft saw a big opportunity where they said, hey, Azure's AKS, now it's available on Azure Stack HCI for those customers who cannot really benefit AKS in public Azure. We will provide AKS service on Azure Stack HCI clusters, right? So which means not only is it running locally in your data center, but it's also helping you to modernize your applications. Uh, so AKS on Azure Stack HCI, right? It's absolutely same. You will see that when actually you'll see the demo as well. It's absolutely similar. There is no difference between AKS running in public Azure versus AKS running on Azure Stack HCI. It's the same experience that that customers would get. Now, the biggest benefit here is that since it's running locally on customer's data center, it actually brings the same goodness of AKS that's available in public Azure. Be it, for example, security or the built-in security features that are available in AKS and Azure, they bring the same thing over to AKS and Azure Stack HCI as well. And it's a best platform for .NET applications. A lot of customers today have their legacy .NET applications typically deployed, but they're begging to be modernized, right? They're not modernized yet. AKS is a great example of that, where they can actually host or start containerizing some of these .NET applications and host them onto AKS as well. It's a journey. It's not a lift and shift, but it's just basically a mindset that customers will start thinking about modernize their on-premises application. And the beauty about all this is it's designed to be hybrid in nature, which means I, as a customer, get to experience all of it, irrespective of where my application is running. Get the bird's eye view of all my IT assets, my distributed IT assets, right from an Azure control plane. That's the power of true hybrid. That's exactly what Microsoft is trying to do here. So if you look at the architecture, right, AKS, well, Google, gave it to the open source community in, way back in 2014, and everybody grabbed it, right? So it was from Project Borg, and everybody grabbed the opportunity to kind of have the same experience. They had their own version of Kubernetes architecture, and so was Microsoft. So basically, what you're trying to see here, it's the same Kubernetes.io that's available as an open source today. That's the same component that's being leveraged even for AKS in public Azure, and the same is being used for AKS on Azure Stack HCI as well. So there's no difference there. So as the industry is making more changes to the Kubernetes architecture, which is the open source tool, so is Microsoft absorbing all of the goodness as well. So from a customer standpoint, they are in line with what the industry is doing. And Microsoft's standpoint, they're in line with what the Kubernetes world is doing. So with that, what they do is, for example, if you see here underlying architecture, you have this the storage platform, basically the hardware platform. since I work for Dell, so we kind of build HCI platforms, which is basically the hyperconverged infrastructure platform, to run Azure Stack HCI. So Azure Stack HCI is an operating system, just like Windows Server. It's a stripped down version of Windows Server. It can only run for virtualization needs, right? And it has tight integration with Azure. That's a big difference, right? But otherwise, technically, there's no difference between Azure Stack HCI operating system versus a Windows Server. Now, Azure Stack HCI operating system is now deployed on these HCI clusters, and then customers can actually run Linux or Windows containers. That's the beauty of AKS. AKS provides you the ability to run both Windows containers, if it is based on Windows kernel, or Linux containers if the container is based on Linux kernel. So that's the power that AKS, it's the same story that you have in public Azure as well, right? So we're trying to bring the same thing onto Azure Stack HCI as well. So the CSI, CNI, and the cluster API, I'm sure all of you may be familiar with, container storage interface and container network interface. So all of this is Kubernetes, plugins that are natively available, but in this case, it's mostly engineered to actually interact with the underlying subsystem, which is Azure Stack HCI. Okay, so in case of Azure, it's the different operating system. It's a different subsystem. So they had to rewrite the CSI, CNI, and cluster APIs to work with Azure Stack HCI as Microsoft brought AKS onto Azure Stack HCI. All right. Now, the biggest thing is, right, so Azure Stack Hybrid, that's a cool benefit of this, right? Now, all of us know, familiar with it, customers today are running virtual machines. It could be Windows virtual machines, Linux virtual machines. What they do is they run it on a more modernized infrastructure, like I said, HCI, running Azure Stack HCI operating system. They will continue to do that. But what about customers who are trying to modernize the same application? That's where they make use of AKS. Now, the beauty of AKS is now you can start modernizing your applications, the customer's applications, which are traditionally virtualized applications. And then not just that, using AKS, they can also bring some of the Azure services. For example, Arc-enabled machine learning, Arc-enabled data services, for example, SQL managed instance, or Postgres SQL. All of this can be brought in just because they're all containerized applications, if you're familiar with. That's why you call them platform as a service, right? When you go to public Azure, you don't care about what's underlying infrastructure that's actually hosting these databases. You just consume the database. The same experience you get here, but the platform that makes it possible is because it is containerized, right? So you need to have some container, basically a Kubernetes architecture that's actually deployed on this, right? So that's where AKS comes into the picture. And Arc-enabled app services like Azure Functions, Azure App Services, Log Analytics. So, a lot of these good platform services are slowly but surely making inroads to be deployed on Azure Stack HCI cluster. Very, very powerful way of doing this, right? I mean, give a huge shout out to Microsoft for even visualizing this, right? A lot of customers are using these services today in public Azure. And what if I told them, you can use the same services on elsewhere, maybe on your own premises, on your hardware. Maybe you can save some costs there, right? So that's really, really a powerful statement here. All right. Any questions before we get started with the demo? Are we all good?
Yeah, all good. So far, so good. I think you are explaining too good. This is why no questions so far.
Okay, all right. Okay, so let's quickly look at deploying AKS on Azure Stack HCI. Now, the one that you're seeing here is the Windows Admin Center. Windows Admin Center is a de facto tool to manage the Azure Stack HCI clusters. Now, those who are familiar with Windows Server, for instance. So Windows Server had System Center suite of products. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with System Center Configuration Manager. Basically, it's the configuration manager, which was managing all the virtual machines, the underlying hypervisor. Hypervisor is nothing but the operating system, which abstracts the hardware layer and presents it to the virtual machine so that the resources are shared, obviously, right? So it's the same concept, right?
Hi, Jay.
Now, what Windows...
Jay, actually, yeah, we just got a quick question. I'm not sure if you have planned to explore the costing in a few slides later, but DR is asking, if you could please discuss the cost saving that comes with using Azure Stack. Maybe, just explore a bit of information in regards to Azure Stack or have everything on cloud. I'm not sure if you have any information about cost. That would be great.
GR, it's a great conversation. Unfortunately, it is very debatable, and it's completely specific to customers' data, existing data that they can host and use. Right? There are a lot of things that attributes to the cost. For example, a lot of customers have longer lease times with Azure. Basically, the reserved instances. Right?
Ah, I see.
Some customers don't, and some customers on premises also have enterprise agreement with software assurance. So it really depends on the dynamics of their licensing portfolio to arrive at any cost. So, but to be very honest, to summarize, just to give you an idea about a very high level,
Yeah.
there is tremendous cost saving when customers are trying to repat. In fact, I can tell you this out of 4 years of experience
Mm-hmm.
running the hybrid show in APJ. A lot of customers are repatriating. One of the biggest reasons now is cost. Okay, so now you get an idea why customers are looking at. But cost is a very, very dynamic thing. It depends on a lot of factors. So it needs to be really factored in before we take a decision. I hope that answers that
Yeah, okay,
question.
okay, I understand. Because of course, companies they might have agreement with Microsoft for 3 years, 5 years. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, cost is always a little bit tricky when we are
Cost is
talking
always tricky.
on Azure. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Anyway, okay. Thank you.
But it's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, So if you see here, Windows Admin Center is a de facto tool you manage your clusters. Now, I'm not getting into the nitty gritties of how do you manage the virtual machine cluster and all of that, because the intention of this particular session is basically AKS. Now, AKS, as you can see, it's right now available within the purview of Windows Admin Center. So convenient, right? So all customers need to do is just open Windows Admin Center, they see AKS, and start setting up AKS by providing basic things that they need to do. So AKS basically does an automatic way of checking the prerequisites that needs to be met, and it checks that's what its system checks go through, and the credential delegation, what, because it needs to access the host, cred ssp needs to be enabled and all of that. And then you also need to provide your host configuration, basically your load balancer settings, your because these are the IP addresses that your workload VMs or the workload cluster will eventually use. All the containers, as you start spinning up containers, each containers, each pods will start consuming IP addresses. That's exactly what you're trying to provide, an IP range. It's called an IP pool, so it can actually get those IPs as a dynamic IP. Right? You can also select static IPs, but that's completely optional. So once you set this up, it's basically what you're trying to do. What I'm trying to do here is deploy the AKS service as a staging on Azure Stack HCI. So now AKS is deployed and it's ready to use. And the next thing is to create a cluster, because when you deploy the service, the next thing that you do is create a workload cluster. So when your workload cluster is, whether it's a Linux VM cluster or a Windows container cluster, those are the things that you will go through. So I'll probably go into this. So this basically is about setting up the AKS service. It takes about just 17 minutes to completely set up the AKS cluster. Okay. All right. So AKS cluster is set up, and let's go to the next one. Once the AKS cluster is set up, use AKS service is set up, you create a cluster. So this is where I talked about whether you want to create a Windows container or a Linux container, all of that, right? So that's the basically the step that you're going through. Okay. So again, does the system checks to make sure AKS is installed, what's available in terms of the hardware. Remember, if it's in Azure, it can dynamically take the hardware. So hardware is not an issue at all. But when it comes to on-premise infrastructure, customer can only scale up within the permissible limits of their data center, right? So, or within the rack, right? So that's the reason why it actually goes and checks what's available, what's the total resource that's available, is it enough to deploy the AKS cluster and all of that. And it's all of this is an automated process, right? That's the power of AKS on Azure Stack HCI. So as you can see, again, it requires, because it's your containers, right? So that's where you start deploying your containers onto the workload pool. So that's the reason why you need a, a start IP, basically the IP pooling with the starting and the ending IP range, so that, the containers can make use of that. All right, so with all the basic settings intact, so in this case, I've used DHCP, as you can see here, but you can use static as well. Once it is applied, it will go ahead and create, in this case, I've actually selected a Linux worker node pool. So it'll go and deploy Linux worker node pool as well, right? So you can do maybe just, in this case, I've just deployed one node cluster, but if you want to, you can actually deploy 3 node clusters or 4, 5, 6, depending on your choice, as long as you have the resources, which is on the Azure Stack HCI. Okay, and once it's all done, it takes about, I think in my opinion, it takes about 20 minutes. It depends. Sometimes I've seen it to take 25 also, but generally around 20 to 25 minutes is what it takes to completely deploy the AKS cluster. Okay, all right. So moving on. Now, we spoke about, I think this is the cluster that we deployed. Now, we deployed the cluster. Now, what about deploying applications? That's the whole intent of all this, right? A lot of customers today that I talk to, one of the customers were very interesting. I kind of want to bring this up here. So one of the customers that I've been talking to in Asia Pacific region, so they have about 800 stores deployed across 800 physical locations. Okay, now one of the biggest challenges that they have, so they have stores, and each of these stores have to be monitored. Okay, so they have these video application running, basically the cameras. So they track the movement of people. Basically, it's basically for theft control and all of that, right? So it tracks the movement of people and what gets picked up and all of that. So they built some artificial intelligence on top of that. The bigger challenge is now all of their applications today are running on virtualized applications, right? So each cluster has its own applications, it's running, and it's doing its own computing and all of that. The bigger challenge is whenever they want to update the application, right? They have to go to each 800 stores and then update it. Think about the amount of time it takes, right? This is exactly where their use case was, hey, can I start containerizing my application? So when you talk about containers, right, that's the power. Now, what you can do is you can use your source control, which is using GitOps, right? I'm sure a lot of developers out here will appreciate that. Once you start using GitOps, the way you develop your application is totally different because it's all container-based. It does not depend on the underlying architecture, that's one. Second, it's so much easier to deploy containers because containers at scale can be easily managed by the Kubernetes orchestration. In this case, it's AKS. So what AKS, so we're going to see the same thing here. Now, as you can see, right, as soon as I clear a cluster, this cluster shows up in public Azure. Magical, right? So in fact, I created a cluster in AKS, which in Azure Stack HCI, which is running on premises. But this cluster is showing up in public Azure. That is the true hybrid that I was talking about. So you see the beauty of managing these clusters and then tying up your Azure pipeline, Azure DevOps, integrate that into the AKS containers that is deployed on premises is magical. I mean, this is what really this customer was looking at, right? He was like, when we showed this demo to the customer, he was like, wow, this is exactly what I want to do. I want to save time because tomorrow the application keeps, they keep releasing the newer versions of the application. There's a new feature that gets rolled out. There's a bug fixes that keep coming. It's so much easier when it's containerized because I can just use a source control like GitOps, for instance, and then apply the change configurations, and each of the container pods running in these 800 stores automatically pick those up, and then the application is latest and greatest. The biggest benefit is, I haven't even spoke about it, is absolutely there is no downtime. That's the beauty of containers, right? Because containers use replicas. So when that means there is a same instance of the same application which is being replicated. For example, I can use replica method, let's say starting from 3 to 30 if I have enough resources, right? So even if I one of the or two of the replicas die, I still have the third replica which is up and running, right? So that's how actually this container, the application upgrade, also called a rollback and updates, is a phenomenal feature with Kubernetes, right? That's all inherently handled. So from a customer standpoint, all the updates to the application is as seamless as possible with absolutely zero downtime. So we're going to see that live in action. So we're going to play that here. Any questions so far? Okay, don't see any questions. All right. Okay, so like I said, you see this, portal.azure.com. You see all the extensions. You see all the Azure constructs here, right? The Azure Monitor, which I can monitor as well using Azure Insights. See, these are familiar Azure constructs that you already know that exist in public Azure. And the beauty is I'm exposing these Azure constructs to my AKS cluster that's running on Azure Stack HCI, right? Very, very powerful way of really managing all of this from a single pane of glass, which is Azure. So what we're trying to do here is when the cluster shows up, we're actually going to set up a GitOps configuration. So GitOps is the way you deploy your application, right? It's a tool from GitLab where this is used. I'm sure, I mean, those of you who are not familiar with GitOps. So it's basically used to, apply your configuration changes to your application, and also build your pipelines. You can use Azure DevOps as a pipeline, all of that, right? In this case, what I am using is basically the GitHub repository. So, which means my application binaries are residing in GitHub. So that's where I specify all the details about my repository URL and all of that, right? So once I set that up, and then I create a cluster config, all I need to do is just change the cluster config if there is an application change. And the moment I go change this, you see this, it gets the application binaries gets picked up from this GitHub repo, right? And once it gets picked up, it gets deployed onto all pods. So all of these pods are running in these 800 different stores, right? So that's the cleverest method of deploying your application, and that's the right way of doing it, right? So as you can see here, it's we are actually just trying to show you what the GitHub cluster config looks like and all of that. So maybe I can just forward this. So what I'll show you is basically a web application. So I've basically deployed a container instance which is running a web service, right? In this case, it's the Nginx web service, and it says this is an Azure Arc GitOps demo. It says Microsoft Azure because it's Microsoft Azure Arc. Can you see this, right? It's not running from public Azure, but it's actually running from one of the pods with the IP address, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make some application changes and commit those application changes. Now, keep seeing on the right-hand side as the application changes are made. So the only thing that I'm trying to make here is I'm just going to change the value of this. This is an Azure Arc GitOps demo to something different, right? Maybe an awesome demo or something. What you can also see is the pods that are running, right? So we will show you the pods that are running here. So you just do kubectl get pods and Azure Arc, that's a namespace, and you can see the pods that are running, right? All of these pods are running. Now what we will do is we will make changes, right? The moment you make changes, it gets picked up from the GitOps configuration, which I showed you, which we created in the previous demo. The moment you commit this, the pods automatically start doing the update process. You see this? The new containers are getting created, right? And then eventually it will terminate the old container. And the new containers are up to date with the latest application. That's exactly what it's trying to do. You see the termination there? So that means older containers are getting terminated as part of the update process, right? So that's really powerful, isn't it? So all of this, I mean, think about it, right? So for so many years, we did not even have option for customers to modernize their applications. Now with AKS available on Azure Stack HCI, it's a very, very neat way of modernizing some of these applications. And the same thing goes with modernizing some of the database applications as well. A SQL managed instance. So those who are not familiar with what is SQL managed instance, a SQL managed instance is a PaaS offering that's available in public Azure. So which is basically a SQL server, which is available as a pay-as-you-go kind of a model, which means I don't have to pay for upfront licensing. There is no licensing because it's always evergreen SQL, because it's always updated. There is no particular version of the SQL Server, like SQL Server 2018, 2022, or whatever, because it's always up to date, right? And the best thing is, me as a customer, I don't have to manage the underlying operating system, which is actually hosting SQL database. That's exactly the reason why customers go to something like SQL Managed Instance, right? Now, what if I told you the same SQL Managed Instance that's available in Azure is now made available on Azure Stack HCI as well? That's exactly what this demo does. So you can see here, you see portal.azure.com. So let me play this. So portal.azure.com. So I logged into, you see Azure Arc, and Azure Stack HCI is a native service that you saw here. So we'll click on Azure Arc, because Azure Arc is where it starts really projecting your on-premises non-Azure resource into Azure. So now you see there's an Azure Stack HCI under Azure Arc as well. You see this? This is a cluster that's actually running on customer's data center, right? In this case, it's actually, I think if I'm not wrong, it's a 2-node cluster. Okay, so let it come up. Okay, so you go to nodes, I think. All right, so okay, it's a 2-node cluster basically. So basically each node is running the Azure Stack HCI operating system, and we have created a cluster out of it, and that's been projected to Azure. You can see that using the Azure Arc service. As you can see, Azure Arc can do a number of things here. So maybe I can just pause here. So those who are not familiar with Azure Arc, there are servers that can reside outside of Azure. For example, it could be a physical server, just a bare metal server, right, running in customer's data center. Or it could be a virtual machine that's actually running in one of the hyperscalers like GCP or AWS, right? Now, what if I want to get a single pane of glass experience, which means I want to surface all of these virtual machines into Azure control plane, right? Now, why would customers do that? The biggest challenge with customers is management, right? How do I manage distributed IT assets? I have to go to Google Console, I have to go to AWS Console, I have to go to Azure Console. And for private infrastructure, I have my own set of tooling. So complicated. What if I give you an ability to manage all of that infrastructure right from Azure? And you get the same feel of running an Azure virtual machine inside of Azure, right? So that is a very powerful statement indeed. That's exactly what Azure Arc is. And Azure Arc is really, really lighting up. Okay, every customer that I talk to is so excited about learning about Azure Arc. So they, in fact, have already learned, and they come to us saying, "Hey, can you tell me more about Azure Arc?" Right? So, please read out if you're not familiar with it. It's a great way of building hybrid infrastructure using Azure Arc. So, like I said, not only can you do virtual machines, but you can also do Kubernetes clusters. So some customers may have standardized on non-AKS container distribution. For example, let's say EKS Anywhere, right, which is an Amazon container distribution, or Rancher, Red Hat OpenShift, for instance. You can surface as long as they're CNCF compliant, right? Cloud native computing, container framework, right? As long as they're CNCF compliant, they can onboard such clusters into Azure using Azure Arc. Okay, and they start showing up, and then you can start deploying your applications onto that cluster right from Azure, right? It's just like how I showed you how you can deploy your application onto AKS running on Azure Stack HCI. You can do the same thing for non-AKS container distributions as well. right? And SQL Server. So some customers may have a traditional SQL Server running on their premises. They can surface that as well. The other biggest benefit that's available is the ability to spin up a virtual machine on Azure Stack HCI clusters, but from an Azure control plane. So, I have created all these beautiful videos, including onboarding an Ubuntu virtual machine that's deployed in GCP in my YouTube channel. So you can go to Giant on Cloud. There are a lot of videos that I've created. Feel free to subscribe and just watch these videos. I'm sure you will appreciate the power of Azure Arc and Azure Stack HCI. Let's get going here. All right, so then you will see now what we're trying to do is we're actually trying to create a SQL managed instance, which is a PaaS offering, right from Azure control plane. But the SQL managed instance actually goes and deploys on Azure Stack HCI clusters. Okay, now think about a customer who says, hey, you know what? My application and data cannot go to public cloud because of data sovereignty needs, because of data gravity. I need a high performance system, high performance SQL server that's running. I don't want to have latency issues because I need to go to Azure through internet, right? Bandwidth issues could be an issue. It should be running on premises, right? For such customers, SQL managed instance on Azure Stack HCI is a very, very nice way of solving such problems, right? So what we are trying to do is, well, this is just a demo session, right? So that's why I've selected developer-friendly option, so that, which means there's no cost involved. But in a production kind of an environment, you want to obviously deploy the right SKUs that are, the same SKUs that are available in public Azure, right? The same set of SKUs are available here as well, right? Whether you want to pick a particular with replicas and without replicas, all of that you can pick and choose depending on the thing that you use, right? And once you create this, just Azure, and then you go here and you see when you click on SQL managed instance, the SQL MI gets deployed here. Now, a SQL managed instance is got deployed here, but the big question is, where is the database, right? So this is where the SQL Studio comes into the picture. Sorry, the Azure Arc Data Studio, right? So you can launch an Azure Arc Data Studio. So as you can see, there's a reference to here, right? So that's how customers manage today as well, right? So Azure Arc Data Studio is extensively extensively used to manage the PaaS offering or even the SQL Server offering as well. Now the beauty here is, even the Azure Arc Data Studio has plugin to Arc, right? So that's how it's actually trying to get that database right into Data Studio. So with this, now I have all the details about my database. I can do backups, I can do update management, I have all the configuration settings. How beautiful is that, right? So, but a SQL Server is running, but I'm using Data Studio as well. Now, so the other thing that I want to show you is, obviously when customers deploy SQL managed instance and PostgreSQL, they also want to manage and monitor these things, right? So you have access to the Kibana dashboard or the Grafana, for instance. So let's see how it actually uses manage using. So the moment SQL managed instance is deployed, the Kibana and the Grafana is already natively deployed. So with the thing, so for example, that gave me the URL. All I need to do is click on that URL. It gives me the complete metrics of my SQL database. Think about if I'm the administrator, I'm managing the IT assets because this particular database is used by a number of developers from different departments. But I am as an administrator, I need to manage and monitor how the health of my database is. They can use Grafana, for instance, right, to get the metrics, the real-time metrics of their database, right? So very, very, very powerful graphical representation of all these metrics can be seen in Grafana. So if customers want to kind of do, let's say, troubleshooting, they want to pull the logs if something happened to their database, right? That's when they can use the Kibana tool as well. So like I said, these are the tools that are very, very heavily used even in public Azure today, especially for customers who are using data services, right? The same set of tools are now made available on Azure Stack HCI as well. Okay, so these are some of the things that really stands where Azure Stack HCI really shines. Okay. All right, so I'm showing you the Kibana. So Kibana dashboard here, where I can query depending on these are based on Elasticsearch, by the way. So you can go and search anything, and Elasticsearch is very, very powerful, by the way. Okay. All right, so I think that comes to the end of the demo. So let's see what we have in store. I think that's about it. So we are probably just on time for about 9 minutes for questions. Jackson, is that a good time to kind of open it up?
No, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I just got a request from one of the guys watching. What's your YouTube channel link? Maybe later on you can share me.
Let me. Sure, I'm not sure if I can put that here.
Yeah.
Or can I? I can't put that
Or
here, right?
if you just put on the
So
on the private chat, and then I can copy and paste.
I can.
Otherwise, I can do a bit later. Yeah, it's not a big deal. Yeah.
So it's here. So it's called. I think everybody can see this.
Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah. The screen is still there. Yeah.
Yeah. It's called Giant on Cloud. Just go to. I mean, you can just Google
and then
Giant
search
on Cloud.
for that. Yeah.
Yeah. So you should get this channel right away.
Okay. Great. Yeah. Yeah, anyway, congratulations, great presentation. And I think for client is always about to give options, to move to the cloud, to stay hybrid, to, as far we can protect all the information, we can comply with the compliancy and all of those things. Of course, at the end of the day, the clients need to make a decision, but it's always nice to have options. Yeah, really, really interesting stuff, I would say.
Yep, indeed.
Okay, yeah, if you don't have anything else, I think we are, let me just check the queue. Okay, yeah, just one more question here. I know this is not a PowerShell session, but how do I use it on work? Yeah, I think some.
Okay, so you can also use PowerShell. In fact, in my GitHub page, in this, right, where I've actually showed, there's an Azure Stack HCI lab, and I've actually provided a link. How do you deploy a SQL managed instance? So all of them are PowerShell scripts. So if your question is, can I manage Azure Stack HCI or even the SQL managed instance using PowerShell? You can, just like you would do today in public Azure. Or so customers use Portal, customers use Azure CLI, or also use PowerShell, right? You can use all three, tooling on Azure Stack HCI as well.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I was out from, just got kicked out from the session. I don't know why, but anyway, back in business.
Okay.
Okay, that's great.
Hope that answered the question.
Yeah.
I think that, yeah. Okay.
Okay, that's great. Okay, Jay, really great presentation. Thanks very much again for being here. And big thanks for everybody watching us from home. And hope you can join ourselves again in our next session. Okay, all the best, everybody. Stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Really appreciate your time. Thank you. Thanks, Jackson. You've been an awesome host.